Ladies and gentlemen, the next session is Michigan's Digital Future, Opportunities in the Connected World. Joining Ingeborg Rocker on stage, please welcome the Executive Vice President and Chief Information Officer of SAS, Keith Collins. Vice President of City Solutions for Ford Smart Mobility, John Kwant. President and Chief Executive Officer of Henry Ford Health System, Wright, Lassiter III.
Great talk.
And to moderate the discussion, please welcome the Executive Vice President and Director of Corporate Operations for Crain Communications, Casey Crain Jr.
All right. I think everyone's going to get their sandwich real quick. Inge, I am so impressed. That was a ton of content to get through in 20 minutes. You did an awesome job. You know, there are so many layers to what you're talking about, and so many different groups of people that have to come together. You know, Keith, when you saw that, how do you even start to piece together layers upon layers from all different sections and groups?
I think there were some really important points. You talked about the network of networks, and that truly is, as we talk about the connected world and its complexity, it's going to be a big issue. She talked about simulation. And simulation does give you this opportunity to see a lot of those interactions. But I also think it's important for us to understand, because right now we're seeing these ads every day with this Wizard of Oz voice, a picture of this little thing in a cloud, as if all the data is going to come there and all the knowledge is going to come back.
That's what you do, though.
But the reality, though, is these things have to be pushed to the edge. That analytic power and decisioning has to become autonomous in the vehicle or at the street level. And the best way I can say this is we went through the manufacturing era where we had command and control. But as we've hit the digital age, every business, every armed forces, every government understands that that autonomous for agility and speed means you have to have action at the endpoints. And this is really, I think, a big transformation and a good piece to think through as Michigan looks at what is the infrastructure play, what is the automated car play, which is how do we bring those analytics to those devices, and now you only send just enough information up to the next line to make the next decision. So it isn't this idea that you send all the data all the time back to the cloud.
Right. John, right, when you guys see a presentation like that and you think about, you know, just what you're trying to do in your own worlds, you know, that kind of communication, you know, from car to infrastructure or healthcare or hospital infrastructure, you know, what's the first thing that comes to mind?
Well, I think the first thing that comes to mind is as Keith mentioned, the tremendous amounts of data that's there and where you appropriately handle it. And I think you're right. It's going to be a multi-layered approach here, just for efficiency's sake, in terms of trying to get to that. And Inge, I thought your presentation was wonderful. It was everything that I'm trying to work on with cities you spoke about in spades. And I think the data, I think often when I've been talking with cities over the past year, they're collecting data but often don't know what to do with it. Yeah. The visualization that companies like yours can provide do help, you know, in trying to provide that. But I think everything that we're doing now is on this path, as Keith mentioned, towards something that's going to be more autonomous and more independent in its thinking. But it's a journey to have the infrastructure in place, to have V2X communication protocols in place, to prepare cities, you know, for this, and to help cities, help them monetize assets that heretofore they didn't necessarily consider as we achieve that future.
So, you know, in the healthcare industry, you know, for the last decade, we've been going through this transformation of trying to get to a place to where we had a digital platform for as much of our data as possible, for most of the patient data. And so now we're at a place, you know, most organizations, healthcare systems, even physician offices are now on a platform where the data can be shared, manipulated, and used in a productive way. So when I think about her presentation, I think about what my colleagues are saying. You know, we're at this nexus point where, you know, historically healthcare has thought about data principally as retrospective data. We've had data in a chart or data in an electronic health record system, and we've looked backwards to see, okay, what does that potentially tell us about the future? Today we're really focusing on both real-time data that is prescriptive, that helps us decide based upon what's happening with an individual today what should we do tomorrow, or frankly, monitoring data remotely and intervening with individuals to help them be healthier or to help them correct illness.
Right. Inge, we chatted a little bit this morning, and we were talking about how some developing cities or countries might skip an entire generation of technology, whether it's a landline or, some type of combustion engine. But when you think about, what's happening in Detroit, do you see a possibility of skipping, instead of trying to piece the infrastructure back together, is there an opportunity to leapfrog?
Yeah, I think there are several opportunities. One, we're talking about a platform, right? If you have that as an integrative data referential, for example, different players could come together and start collaboration. I think that's one. That's not leapfrogging, though, answering your question. So leapfrogging, yes, you could say, because of the desolate situation we have, this is actually a surplus value here, because we don't need to pay too much attention to what exists. And therefore, we could go in with a complete new comprehensive planning. And that planning would, when I talk about this virtual twin, right, let me just explain one more time what it means, because it's more than just visualization of data. It's the active planning, setting out requirements, designing, simulating the design, executing the design, and doing project management, so optimizing the entire creation flow, and then linking that also to the run. And that's when real time becomes so critical right now, because you want to then, what is built, monitor it back and compare it with what the assumption have been in the virtual, right? So, and that complete virtual twin is a top opportunity, I believe, in Detroit, because you could say, if we can lay the groundwork for something completely fresh, then we can start with the requirements and the virtual version of it first, right? Like a green, like some project you just do on a green field, and almost treat Detroit like a green field for a moment, right? And I think that could leapfrog into a total new realm where we're not that far away at all to realize that. So I hear what the colleagues say. I'm a little disagreeing in a way that let's not pocket again away into silos. The approach would be try to integrate as much as you can, not everything, of course selectively, but let's not silo for a chance, because that's what we do all the time, and that's where our problems lie at this point, intellectually as much as organizationally.
So it's almost the more decayed the infrastructure, the bigger the opportunity. It's one way to look at it.
That's a beautiful way to say it. Yes, I think that's that's absolutely correct. Yeah.
So John, talk. You guys have been in the news a little bit this week.
This week or last week?
Yeah, next couple of weeks maybe.
It's not every day your boss becomes CEO. No.
Yeah, it's a good place to be.
It's a good place to be. Yeah.
Talk a little bit about the role you guys see as Ford Motor Company, but also the bigger role for the mobility scene and how that's going to play into everything that we've touched on here.
So we've obviously, and the governor mentioned this, we've been helping people move for over 100 years in one form or another. And we believe that what we've been talking about in terms of new mobility models, in terms of different modes, we have a role to play in that. It's one of the reasons we've acquired companies like Chariot, because if you think about that value proposition, here's a van, which we actually manufacture, and it's an extension of the value chain. So the slide that Inge had up earlier from us, we're taking a company that's for over 100 years has built products and has primarily done that in an ownership model. You left the dealership and you either purchased it or financed it, through Ford Credit or another financing arm. And over the last, I would say, 5 to 10 years, you've seen an evolution of a transportation system that's looking more at shared ownership and a services-based model.
Because before the car would just sit.
The car would be idle. So, and in urban settings, if we believe all of the forecasts in terms of how much of the world's population is going to be in cities, this is where the problem becomes most acute in terms of moving people around. And we often like to talk about flow, helping cities manage flow in terms of not only people but goods. And how do we help them increase carrying capacity within the system that they have? I lived in Shanghai for 3 years, and putting another ring road around Beijing or any of the larger megacities that are developing aren't going to alleviate the congestion that occurs in the inner city. So we have to fundamentally think about how do we change the definition of carrying capacity, and how do we look at higher carrying capacity options like shuttles versus personal occupancy vehicles, because if we believe the trends, everybody can't own a car and live in the city. People won't get anywhere.
Right. And so you guys are going to have to be working through the data play as well, specifically around congestion and trying to open up some of those urban areas.
We envision a world that's going to be completely connected ultimately, right? And as a car becomes just another node in the Internet of Things, helping orchestrate that connectivity to more efficiently move those vehicles around is what we see.
Right. And Wright, we talked a little bit earlier about a lot of the things that companies like Ford and like Lear, they're trying to put sensors into seats and make seatbelts a monitor. How do you see some of this data playing into your pipeline and what you guys are trying to do?
So it's interesting, as John just talked about Internet of Things and being one more node on a connected society. I don't know that I ever thought about the healthcare system in that way, but I think it's a very appropriate way to think about it, frankly, that when you think about organizations like Ford or Lear or others that are using technology and sensors to help with a lot of things from their perspective around driver alertness, et cetera. From our perspective, we would look at that in terms of if there were to be an event, how would we ensure that caregivers responding to a scene have the most current patient data available to them to help ameliorate the situation and to bring that patient hopefully back to a state of normalcy. And so we're working on things like that, where we think that now that we have a digitized healthcare environment, how would we be able to propagate the delivery of that patient's data at any point in time? Mm-hmm. And so that's one of the ways we think about sort of the hospital, the healthcare system being a node in this Internet of Things, as John describes.
So Keith, as all of these things start talking to each other and really playing together, you're saying we have to stay away from a command and control, but how do you see the communication?
Well, so part of it is all about the expense and the flow. Mm-hmm. And flow is a great way to use the word, because it really is about making the decision at the right place, but you want to optimize for the whole of the network and the network of networks. So you have this tremendous opportunity now to actually embed the analytics in the car. I like the example of the smart grid, because you actually have the meter on the house, and the meter on the house is going to help you actually optimize the activities in the house. Then you have the smart in the transformer, and you're going to have just enough information flow so that you can optimize that utility for that distribution of the cul-de-sac. Mm. And then you're going to flow just enough information up so the distribution center is doing the most optimum delivery of power either in or out as more and more homes deliver energy outbound. So I think it's that flow of information that's going to be the opportunity here. The other thing that I think goes along hand in hand with all of these examples, which is, since we're at a policy conference, right, is...
Stay on message, I like that.
Yeah, which is... how do we talk about data for good? Mm-hmm. Right? Europe is about to make a huge mistake and say that unless you can tell me how you're going to use the data, you can't collect it. Collecting the data actually
tells you what to do.
Tells you what you can do. All the great eureka moments through history is because somebody had the data and then had this insight to do something different. And one of the opportunities here in Michigan is to look at policy about the use of data, not about the collection of data. And that can change the game. You talked about, yes, technology can leapfrog, but the thing that allows that leapfrog to happen are the policies in place to go with it. So I think there's a real opportunity there as we talk about the flow of data and who can collect it, and making sure you aren't penalizing the collection of it, but penalizing inappropriate use of it.
Casey, can I just say, so this point is one that's always been a thorn in the side for healthcare, right? Because clearly when you're talking about protected patient information, personalized health information, everyone wants that data protected, and everyone wants to be sure that it's not used inappropriately. And I do think that Keith's comment is a very instructive one around policy making, because there's an extreme amount of regulation today that at times, I won't say prohibits, but I'll say makes difficult the ability to think very broadly about how we might share information in a different way. And for us, as we begin thinking about wearable sensors and swallowable technology
swallowable technology.
Yeah. I mean, so you sort of think about swallowing a pill with nanotechnology that will monitor your blood levels of your drugs, and so your prescription drugs. So doctor then could effectively know how well you are or are not taking your medication based upon how your blood level spikes of your Lipitor, of your, some might say that's a little too much intervention in my life.
Somebody out there just thought that.
But imagine having your cell phone,
Mission Impossible
getting
anymore.
a text message or a phone call saying, Mr. Lassiter, we've noticed that you haven't taken your X in the last couple of days. We need to see you in the office. That's really something that's just right around the corner.
Wow.
I have also one comment to this, because I think the question for me is whose asset is the data, in a way? Because you could say, well, let's make it as open and it's free flow for everybody who can monitorize it. Or one could say, hey, let's recognize data as an asset. For example, personal data. It's an asset. Look at how much value Google generates out of that information that we all freely give. The same, you could say, a city could understand suddenly a new asset resource, right? So could be, hey, I'm not giving the data just away. I'm actually asking for something.
Oh, monetize. Yeah.
Monetizing, yes, and so that's then a new economy. Again, it could be a new taxation model almost that could arrive through that. So, and I think
Don't give them any ideas.
I'm just having this overflow of ideas, so I just give some away. But no, I mean it seriously, because I think the larger companies that are savvy in data collection take that just for granted right now, that the data is available in some ways. And I frankly was disturbed by one decision recently made that I, as an individual, cannot decide upon my data at this point in the US. And I find that inappropriate, because it should be me making a decision and owning it in a way. So that is, of course, I'm all for making something out of the data, as you have seen my presentation. So, but I think that's something where we all need to come together and figure out a proper path. And I don't think the path currently is taken is informed enough.
You were smiling, though, she said.
Well, I actually think there's this huge opportunity. Most people know blockchain in terms of Bitcoin. But one of the most interesting things about blockchain...
Did you buy any Bitcoin?
It's an interesting technology. So the interesting piece around blockchain is this idea of smart contracts. And we're sitting on this opportunity potentially to have everybody have a smart contract about their own personal information. And they can decide automatically how much data to share, when they want to share it, who they want to share it with, which may help us solve some of these challenges of, it's my asset, do I want to share it? And if I do share it, do I want to benefit from any outcomes? We have this real dilemma if we go back to the healthcare on cancer. If we don't allow us to capture all this information and look across clinical trials, there's many of the cures that we will fail to see. And you have to ask yourself, if you had to fully anonymize that data to be able to find that, where then is the moral opportunity, if you found the cure, to go back to those who were anonymized in the data to actually let them know? And potentially, if we had a smart contract, we could make that connection back to say, yes, there's now a cure. So I think there is this opportunity to accomplish both of these, and we need to work hard at it.
I think you're right. I think what we like to talk about when this topic comes up is the whole notion of data stewardship, right? There's a role to play, there's a role to protect the individual, but if you can clearly explain what the benefits are for them opting in at certain levels and they can see that benefit, they do it. I mean, people do it right now when you launch Waze, right? I've opted in to share data because I'm receiving information that's valuable on that, right? Or at least you should opt in. You know, there's people who use Waze and said, well, I'm not going to let them know where I am or I'm slowing down. Well, this is a tragedy of the commons in a respect, and so are things like you mentioned about not being able to aggregate all the available data there for the greater public good, yet still keep it anonymous and safe.
So Inge, I've been excited ever since I saw your presentation, thinking about the possibilities with Detroit. And the governor started this conference off by saying we should be doing things. We need to do things. It's very easy to get overwhelmed when you think about all these different layers of data. You know, one government department, let alone all of them, plus maybe healthcare and mobility. What can we actually do? I mean, what is Singapore doing? You guys are doing the 3D experience. What can we do now?
Okay.
We want to be leaders in this
yes,
space.
So what I would do first would be proposing a pilot, just a doable slice of it, just to test out what do we have in terms of data that is available and what one can do with it. But more importantly, I think you need to garner certain stakeholders around the topic. So I think you need to get the agreement from city officials, ideally the state sponsorship, and you definitely would like to get the private sectors, because there are very strong figures within Detroit, as far as I know, that are driving a lot of the reconstruction. And those figures I would bring in. Then, frankly, maybe one layer already too many, but I think there is a good opportunity to involve the car industry here. And having that pilot happen to be also maybe an autonomous car driving test ground in the virtual and in the real, because you have it right in front of you, right at the doorstep. So why not? So that would be how I would bring certain players for now together. And I mean, health, you can add any layer afterwards. Health could be added right away as well. But Singapore, we started with literally a data collection and the integration of that data, the federation of the data, and launching the platform. So, and then successively more and more data is accumulating, and there's a big challenge because the data usually not necessarily matches up. You realize the data sets are all over the place. So, and one of the key problems—
They're all smiling at this.
Yeah, one is then what becomes the driving referential? And by the way, who makes the decisions that this is the referential, right? So, and again, that's why I would go for a plot, mile by mile, something, or that would be discussed by the stakeholders, what makes sense to them in terms of scale. Mm-hmm. Not too small, but also not too large.
All right. Keith, you try and put a little sex around data, and I've heard you reference a couple times. No, I think it's admirable. I love it. But you talked a lot about the value of data for the public, which we just mentioned. Making the right decisions around the vehicle. But you always talk about bringing analytics to the edge.
Yeah.
Explain that.
So, one of the things that's about to happen to all of us is the streaming of information. Today? In the course of the next couple of years.
Okay.
Many of you have probably heard either parts of your organization talk about the data warehouse and talk about the collection of all that data. And in today's world, you collect all that data, you throw it onto some disk, you have some very complicated joins to try to get the reference correct, and then you can try to get an answer. And part of what's going to turn upside down is we're going to do all of that in the stream. In the stream of the data, we're going to clean it up. In the stream of the data, we're going to identify the other relationships. And we're going to collect all the data to the point where you can immediately do the analysis. So as an example, we're doing that today in the cybersecurity arena, where we're taking all the network data, and in flight, with that network data, we're starting to look up, well, who's that IP address associated with internally? What asset is that associated with? Is that an HR machine? Is it a finance machine? And then immediately doing the correlation in close to near real time. And we see that we're working with a trucking fleet now where we've moved that computation out into the truck. We're working with Cisco. We've moved some of that computation out into the edge of the actual data collection point. Gotcha. For all the collection. So in our world, we're talking about changing the nature of the flow of data with streaming engines where you're embedding the analytics directly at the endpoint. That's the change, and it'll change the way people collect data, augment the data, and do the analysis in real time.
John, when you guys talk about, he's talking about being on the edge out in the field, you guys are doing the same thing with your vehicles. Where do you see, when you talk about the city tomorrow, where do you see that inflection point where all of a sudden it goes from combustion engines, where you're making all your money today, to that connected future state where the cars are, are talking to each other, creating a more safe environment, talking to the environment, the buildings, the streets. How do we get there? I mean, what's that point where somebody draws a line in the sand?
Well, I don't think it's at one point in time. I don't think it's at some steep inflection, but I think it does become, once the vehicles become connected, once you get battery technologies to a point where they can be more widely deployed and are essentially more economical than combustion engines, both from a charging standpoint as well as the cost of the battery, and the whole notion of range anxiety, how do you get over that? I think all of those things can become exponential, especially when things become increasingly connected. Mm-hmm. And I also think cities will be at different paces. I think There'll be some cities who truly adopt this notion and want to help in the orchestration of all the data and all the nodes on there, and others that won't, right? Those cities will probably be more likely prepared to support an autonomous future, because you're not going to be able to have an autonomous vehicle without that kind of orchestration in place, even if it's very geo-limited. The example that I like to use is that imagine putting an AV, a single AV, on the streets of New York right now, and the fact that it's always going to default to safety. And anyone who's ridden in a cab in New York City knows how
it's
those
set
cabs,
to the opposite default.
There's this vehicle will be paralyzed, right? So you need a critical number of mass, right, to make this all kind of work, and a critical amount of connectedness, if you will,
right,
in order for it to be as efficient and work as well as it could.
I mean, that's the joke, right? All the cars in Silicon Valley are all banged up because all the humans crash into them.
I'd like to ask a question. Do you expect corporate parks and universities actually to be the early adopters on that curve, places where you have a more controlled arena, if you will?
I think they definitely can become test sites. I mean, if you look at what we're attempting collectively in the industry, and certainly with the facilitation of people here in the state in Ypsilanti, that is in essence, the Aerotropolis is a closed campus where you're trying to achieve that, right? But those are all ripe opportunities to learn. I think the notion that Inge proffers of creating the construct, creating the model, and then doing something in real time, it's the same thing that you almost talked about, putting things on the edge. It's what you talked about in terms of providing that forward deployment of data where it can be used, in the vehicle. I mean, all of these are very rich, I think, in terms of opportunity. But, we're just starting to understand how we network these nodes and how we can use all that. And we've got data issues. There's a lot to work out. So I don't see one inflection point, but I see a lot of learning.
I'm just pitching him. We got a large campus, lots of buildings. And
I'm actually with you.
I want him there.
Right. What's a hospital look like in the next 10 years? Does the footprint change? I mean, as these cities are changing, is a hospital and the way people interact with healthcare changing?
Short answer is yes and no. So, when most people build hospitals, hospitals unfortunately are 50+ year buildings, right? And in most communities, the hospital represents more than just a building. It represents, an economic engine in terms of job creation, not to mention all the healthcare stuff. But clearly, as we're moving towards a much smarter society, you will not go to a healthcare facility for all the things you used to go to there for. And as you're able to get remote monitoring, as you're able to get wearable technology that could frankly transmit your EKG back to your cardiologist versus you going to her or his office to get an EKG strip done, you're going to need less of those things, right? As we get into more and more virtual and digital visits, for us at Henry Ford, we did about 3.2 million digital visits last year. And so as you get more and more and more of those, you have less foot traffic at some point in time.
Does it take pressure off the system?
It does, and what you end up having is that what you're left with in hospitals are really sick people. I mean, so you don't get the less acute folks in your hospital, you get the most acute people in your hospital. And so, hospitals become larger and larger intensive care units because that's what you need to be hospitalized for, not for some of the minor things. And so it does, as we think about planning for the future, it does put pressure on us as you think about facility investment because, smart money isn't on building more and more, certainly not more and more inpatient beds. Mm-hmm. And you have to really think about how you deploy capital assets around physician office. One other point I just wanted to make related to the comments that my colleagues have made earlier. We're going to try to create something pretty soon, which is this competition for tomorrow's data. So we haven't talked about precision medicine and personalized medicine as of yet. And as this conference is about opportunities for Michigan, one of the great opportunities for Michigan is that the National Institutes of Health designated 8 lead organizations around the country to get 1 million Americans and their entire human genome into a personalized medicine database that we can begin using to tailor cancer treatments. Henry Ford happens to be one of those 8 around the country, and we've partnered with Spectrum out in Grand Rapids and with folks in other states. And so we're going to be working hard to enroll 125,000 Michiganders into a personalized medicine database that will help us look for the treatments of the future.
Do they have to swallow anything? Do they?
We won't tell you that until you sign all the disclaimers, and then we'll let you know. But you know, as you think about that, you know, there's still in society, there's some of us that don't really want to know. Like, we don't want to know that we've got a latent gene for X, so we've got a latent thing for Y. But many of us do, and so, you know, we think it's going to create a competition for folks who really do want to sign up, because not only do they want to contribute to this database with 1 million people, but they also want the benefits of early information that tells them about not just themselves, but their kids and their grandkids and what their family may be susceptible to, and how do you tailor treatments around that.
Liver function during the policy conference.
There you go.
There'd be a lot of texts going off right now. Inge, I want to push back a little bit on your presentation. You know, I asked John about the inflection point for, you know, the mobility space. Think about it from an urban space as well. You know, we have a lot of old buildings, and when you try and update an old building, it's a lot more difficult than starting from the ground up. And if we built your future state from the ground up, it probably wouldn't be as difficult. So do you think it's the same situation where you've got to get some mass? I mean, you can do a mile by mile test case, but then, you know, as new construction goes up, you know, you have a piece here and a piece there before everything gets integrated?
Yeah, so I think you don't need to have a 3D, by the way. I know we're a 3D company, but you know, sometimes when I show the Singapore Rolls-Royce, other cities get scared because they think, oops, we don't have the funding for this. And they're probably right. So you can start very gentle with a set of data that is relevant for you and your planning. It could be, you know, resulting in a 2D. The key thing is really the consolidation, federation of the data and the collaborative working environment that enables people to come together. So that would be a slow start, let's say. Then, of course, you could say, okay, cities from now on, whatever is going to be built, in order to be checked off as buildable, has to come in a particular format that then arrives in that format and can immediately be embedded, like a BIM model, for example, right? So you can set up certain requirements that, again, policy will enable to grow this model much faster. Then, of course, depending on what the funding situation is and also what the stakeholders' interest is, and that's why I think the private sector is so relevant here, you can, of course, also digitize that which exists. That happens quite a bit. In Germany, for example, they digitized pretty much the Autobahn, the highway system, and they do that in preparation for the autonomous cars. So it's literally their test ground. And they have digitized it in an obsessive manner, in a precision I was shocked to see. But of course, Germans, and I'm German, so I should know. But you know, so but again, it's a matter of what also we're aiming at, right? For which purpose do we want to capture what is there? So either in terms of what data sets already exist, or what data sets do we need to generate for which purpose? And that's again, as my colleague here says, we don't maybe know even the purpose yet, right? So there's a combination of things. On one hand, you want to flood in as much data in as you can in order then to detect patterns within it. SAS does that. At the same time, you may be more actively having to create data that you may need for the autonomous car to drive through cities and use the city as a virtual model. And then again, you might more almost tactical find data that is already suitable to have a start and to start the whole process of creating this type of model. Do you see that? So it's a step model approach.
He's right. She's all of this, the hours that each of the OEMs are trying to, you know, aggregate in terms of drivable hours on AVs. It's all because it's creating data, right? We're learning from that. That's what it's about.
We talked a lot, I mean, there's always the topic of disruption in all of these industries and platforms. We're talking today about evolution and in some cases revolution. Talk a little bit, and I'd love for all of you to comment just on the role that startups are playing now and new thinking in either industries or the technologies around what you guys are doing and how you can kind of harness that thought process.
I shouldn't go first. So.
Are we going to be here for a while?
No, I think they play a critical role. We've done things. We obviously have our outpost in Palo Alto to try and be part of that culture and understand opportunities when they're there. We've invested in several small companies, some different levels of positions. Chariot is a startup, a 3-year-old shuttle company, not really high tech, but when you look at the app that you can book a ride on, it's part of the shared economy. We've also got partnerships with Fontanellis and RPM Ventures that help us, with monitoring the activity out there. And it's the innovation that occurs in this disaggregated sense that allows it to really flourish, right? And look at things that you're not beholden to a corporate construct. You're not beholden to a certain way of having built things. And they can truly challenge things. So I think they play a huge role in the mobility ecospace, and it's why we've sponsored things like the Go Detroit Mobility Challenge, was to hear from folks in Detroit, what are your challenges, what are your needs, and what are companies there that can actually help service those.
Okay. So for us, about 5 years ago, we founded the Henry Ford Innovation Institute for this very purpose, right? It was to look at trying to harvest ideas from within the organization that we could then partner with others to look at the evaluation of commercialization. And so we have 300 plus ideas that are currently under evaluation in our Innovation Institute, and I think we're up now to just over 20 patents that we've applied for, and half dozens have been issued on things that have come out of that process. So for us, we look at it. We look at the opportunity for startups to help serve as an accelerant for idea generation within the healthcare space, and to help us move faster, because sometimes in formal healthcare we don't move as rapidly as you see with startups and with venture capital folks that are working on ideas like that. And so it's helped us tremendously spawn new ideas and help us think more creatively about how do we bring things to light. The one space where probably startups aren't as big today is with nanotechnology. I mean, that's not so much the startup space. I'd say only probably 1% of all that stuff's happening with startups. That's bigger companies that are doing that. But we're finding a host of ideas from drug studies to devices that improve what we're doing. Actually, the CEO of our Innovation Institute came to my office a week and a half ago with this cylinder. And he's a surgeon as well. And when a surgeon comes in your office with a tool, it makes you a little uncomfortable. And he pulls this thing out, and I said, "What are you going to do with that?" I said, "I thought this was a professional visit, not a medical visit, And he goes, "I want to show you a new thing that we're working on, and a device that's an alternative to very expensive robots. So robots are $1 million, multi-million-dollar devices you can use in prosthetic surgery and kidney surgery, and he's working on developing with this very small startup a new device that's an alternative that would be a 1/100th of the price of a robot, but have almost the same level of dexterity with a surgeon doing procedures. And so all kinds of really cool stuff happening in healthcare these days.
Inge, you mentioned the importance in your presentation.
Yes, I witnessed in Israel actually how important startups are there. There's a whole cultivation of startups that are incredibly profitable. I mean, Waze came out of this as well. And I think looking at opportunities, linking it back to the Detroit vision maybe of such a model, I think it could be really stimulating a whole startup scene. And somewhat, I think Detroit is destined for this because it's relatively cheap to live here. Mm-hmm. Young people could come and become initiated if you give them a common ground. The only risk I see if startup after startup comes and runs wild, particularly for the city, I think it's critical that you reintegrate their efforts into a common ground. Not to strangleize them, but really to foster it and to make it this kind of network effect. Otherwise, you end up like an iPhone with many, many apps that are all separate but don't integrate. And I think that could be another argument for this type of city platform that I'm pushing.
I think Techstars, we all know pretty well, is just really attempting to do a lot of that, providing that common platform and connectivity to both sponsors and potential customers.
I'll tell Ted you gave him a nice plug here today.
Ted's great. Yeah. Ted's great.
Yeah. I think I'll say that one is I think they're critically important. Two, we're lucky that we have a legal system that supports it and lets it flourish. 3, I think we're at risk right now the way the VCs are draining the startups so quickly, forcing them to sell out instead of being able to mature. And 4th, I take a personal affront that we somehow are stuck in this cycle that innovation happens outside of our large corporations once we get too large. That somehow we don't harness all of what we built in goodness. So actually, the reason I passed it first is just I also wanted to encourage people to look inside their organizations to how do they unleash innovation that's trapped there. They hired brilliant minds when they hired you.
Yeah.
Why aren't you still operating that way? Right?
So
it's just, I think there is this opportunity to have this long view come back both from the startups as well as the corporations.
That's a great point. Inge, again, congratulations on your presentation. I thought it brought a lot of great thought leadership, and the rest of the panel. Thank you, guys. Can't wait to see what comes next. How about, ladies and gentlemen, a round of applause for our panelists. Thanks, everybody. Thank you.